Young America's Foundation, bringing the leaders of the conservative movement to you. Fighting liberal intolerance on college campuses and spreading conservative ideas to thousands of young people each year. For more information, please go to www.yaf.org.
Thank you very, very much. I'm truly honored to be here, and both Callista and I are very excited about what will be our first visit up to the ranch, and so we're thrilled to be here. It has been a great honor to be allowed every summer to address the hundreds and hundreds of students who you gather in Washington for their summer conference. It's always covered by C-SPAN. It's always an opportunity to talk about big ideas in bold ways. And it's the work you're doing at creating a new generation of leaders and at spreading the principles and the facts and the history that got us here is really, really important. It is, I have to confess, it's a thrill to stand out there. We just did a few minutes ago with a piece of the Berlin Wall. And if you haven't stopped and looked at that for a minute, Callista and I are now, with Dave Bossie's leadership, in the process of developing a DVD about President Reagan's impact historically. And the fact that you cannot, and this is really one of the most fascinating parts of the post-Reagan era, that you cannot explain the disappearance of the Soviet Union without explaining President Reagan, despite the efforts of an amazing number of tenured faculty members to somehow describe that entire decade as though Reagan was never quite president. And gradually, slowly, with Michael Reagan's leadership and the hard work of many other people, I think we're actually winning this argument. I think it's gradually sinking in that President Reagan was a unique leader, that he did unique things, and that as a result, freedom was expanded and tyranny shrank, and that there are a lot of lessons our generation can learn from that experience. I remember, I think I was first dramatically impacted by President Reagan when he was governor. I was a graduate student at Tulane, and I had been I got interested in the process of self-government in 1958 when my dad was serving first in France and then in Germany, and we saw the cost of bad leadership and the cost of bad government. And we came to Georgia in 1960. And when the governor's race was fascinating and it was interesting, but it didn't stun me. I was first stunned by Governor Reagan when he debated Bobby Kennedy on a CBS program that involved foreign students asking about America's role in the world. And it was fascinating because you could see Senator Kennedy was schizophrenic. He wanted to, this was, remember, as the Vietnam War. It's a period of very hardline left-wing hostility. It's a period when the rise of the modern class of essentially anti-American, anti-freedom, appeasement-oriented left-wingers can be traced to. And much of the modern news media and much of the modern academic pathology can be traced back to this period. And people like Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Kennedy were permanently schizophrenic because they really wanted to appease these students. So when some student would say a disgustingly, totally anti-American concept, they would, on the one hand, want to make them feel good by saying, well, I certainly understand why you said that disgusting, totally anti-American thing. But you could see inside their head the calculus that they couldn't be too pro-anti-American and survive in American politics. So then they would waffle. And Governor Reagan, as he was at that time, wasn't confused by all this. First of all, he actually didn't quite care if a nutcake, left-wing, totally ignorant student liked him or not. He thought, when the kid grows up and learns something, he'll probably like me. And until then, why work? If I get this wrong, Michael's going to jump up and say, no, that part you missed. And so there was a happiness to his ability to argue. Because he actually wasn't trying to convince the student. He was trying to convince everybody else. And the student was an opportunity because the student was so nuts that for everybody else watching, Bobby Kennedy lost ground every time he semi-agreed because they thought, that's weird. I mean, why would you agree with that? And I'll never forget there was a moment where Governor Reagan turned and said straight into the camera to all these foreign students, do any of you honestly believe that if in 1945 Joseph Stalin had had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, that we would be having this dialogue in a free country. And you see the students were all stopped because nobody had ever challenged them and asked them something like that head on. And it was such an obvious question, and the answer was so obviously against their values that they literally didn't know what to say. Now, unfortunately, Senator Obama has never met Ronald Reagan, and so he didn't quite get this educational experience, and so he hasn't learned any of these new things yet. But there's a great deal of parallel between the ignorance of the left, which culminated in Jimmy Carter's administration, which was a serious effort to prove you could be totally out of touch with reality and still govern. My first direct personal contact with Governor Reagan was towards the end of his governorship. He came to campaign in Georgia. I've always had a very bad sense of timing. And so my first campaign for Congress was in 1974 during Watergate. And as Republican, support kind of went downhill every week. I remember once going into the CNS Bank to see the president. I was running against the dean of the Georgia delegation, the fourth-ranking member of the Appropriations Committee. I was a Yankee-born Republican with a weird name and a strange accent as a college professor running for Congress. And he looked at me and he said, "Young man, I really like what you're doing. I really think you're a great leader for the future, but I noticed when I got up this morning that your party just lost Gerald Ford's seat, which it had held since 1905. Now, if you can't keep a seat in central Michigan, which has been solidly Republican for 70 years, why do you think you're going to beat the dean of the Georgia delegation?" I have to confess, I didn't have a very good answer that day, but he did back me the next time I ran. And so I was out in a very lonely, very difficult thing, and Governor Reagan came through. I think he had one California state trooper with him, and it was towards the very end of his career. It was in October. And I was given the great honor. This is the great virtue of running for Congress, even if you lose. I was given the honor of escorting him to the airport. And as sometimes happens, the plane he was going to get on was late. And so we actually had an hour in a private room to sit and chat. And I was talking about my campaign. He was asking very good questions, as he always did. And he pulled out his cards. And he said, "Let me show you how I organize a speech." And he was walking me through the method that he used. And any of you who've ever watched me give speeches know I almost never use any notes. And it's because I literally learned and studied his model, which is you have a series of points you want to make. You deliberately reorganize them depending on the day. And you have to figure out a transition from point A to point B. And since all the possible cards are so many, every speech is unique, even if it's the same theme. And so the tension of trying to figure out how you're going to transition from A to B to C guarantees that you don't know quite what you're saying, and the audience intuits that. So the audience is leaning forward, and it's a very spontaneous speech, although you're largely delivering the same message. And so I studied this. So I literally have been studying in a very proactive way since 1967 how Governor and then President candidate and then President Reagan thought. And I was just telling Mike, I really want to recommend to all of you an extraordinary book I read last year called The Education of Ronald Reagan, which I believe holds a fundamental lesson for modern conservatives, in that it's about the years of General Electric. And it's a very interesting story in general, but it has 2 points in particular that I hadn't understood, even though I'd been studying Reagan for 40 years. The first is that the man he worked for, a man named Lemuel Boulware, who was the vice president for employee relations, had a model that he called moving the M. He said in every conversation, there's a middle, an accepted center of the conversation. And then what the left does to us is the left puts the center of the conversation over here on their terms. So if you look at Gore's various works on the environment, he starts with a version of reality which is over here. And if you accept his version, you can't win.